During his tenure as consul during the 52 BC year, Pompeius Magnus, who, from Februarius until Quintillus, held the consulship without a colleague under the auspices of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, and, from Sextilis until December, shared the consulship with his new father-in-law, Metellus Scipio, enacted two very important pieces of legislation. 3 years earlier, Pompeius had shared the consulship with Crassus as part of an agreement made with Caesar at what is known today as the Conference at Luca. Caesar used one of his tribunes of the plebs to legislate the Lex Tribonia, which granted Crassus a 5-year term as proconsul of Syria, and granted Pompeius a 5-year term as proconsul of Hispania. And although he had remained in Rome, choosing to govern through his legates, Pompeius had no plan to give up his province, nor the attached source of loyal legions. And so, in 52 BC, likely under the protections of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, Pompeius Magnus legislated for himself an additional 5 years as Hispania's governor. The second piece of legislation Pompeius carried in 52 BC was a Senatus Consultum, or proposal from the Senate, which had been written by the consuls of the 53 BC year, Domitius Calvinus and Messala Rufus. Calvinus and Rufus, instead of being elected in 54 BC, to serve the 53 BC term, as it should have been, did not assume their consulships until halfway through their 53 BC term. This was due to the scandal and trial which had engulfed the 54 BC consuls, Appius Claudius Pulcher and Domitius Aenobarbus, as well as consular candidates, Gaius Memmius and Marcus Aemilius Scaurus, both of whom belonged to Pompeius Magnus. Moreover, 53 BC wasn't even the first time consular elections had been delayed, though to date, it was the longest of the delays. The summer elections of 56 BC, for the 55 BC consulship had also been postponed, due to the gang warfare and violent disruptions of Publius Clodius, delaying Pompeius's and Crassus' election to the consulship until Caesar's legions arrived from Gaul, to swing the vote. Even Cicero's year as consul had seen trials for electoral bribery and corruption take place. Electoral bribery and subsequent trials were becoming yearly events. And so, when Domitius Calvinus and Messala Rufus took office halfway through the 53 BC year, they began pushing for a Senatus Consultum which they thought would solve multiple problems related to electoral corruption. Following the dictatorship of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, lots for provinces were dictated by the Lex Sempronia de Provincies Consularibus. The Lex Sempronia decreed that holders of imperium, such as praetors and consuls, must leave to take up their governorships immediately following their terms in Rome. Because there was a 2-year gap in age eligibility for candidates running for the offices of praetor and consul, many consular candidates, like Caesar, used their propratorships to enrich themselves within that 2-year period, and then returned to Rome in order to stand for the consulship. Marcus Aemilius Scaurus, who had been destitute following his aedileship, had mysteriously returned from his propraetorship in Sardinia with so much money that he could suddenly afford to run for consul. Pompeius Magnus's nephew, Gaius Memmius, following his propraetorship in Bithynia, had also amassed sufficient wealth to not only stand for consular election, but in the same year, offer substantial bribes to the previous consuls, Appius Claudius Pulcher and Domitius Aenobarbus, in exchange for their fixing the election. The subsequent trial surrounding this scandal also brought to light the ambitions of Appius Claudius Pulcher, who sought the governorship of his brother, Gaius Claudius Pulcher's neighboring province. And so the Senatus Consultum was introduced near the end of 53 BC. Calvinus and Rufus labored to garner senatorial support for legislation of a law which would forbid praetors from taking up immediate governorships following the end of their terms, requiring instead a 5-year waiting period. In this way, praetors could not do as Marcus Aemilius Scaurus, Gaius Memmius, and even Caesar had done, and use their provinces to make war and gain wealth, which would then give them the advantage when running for the consulship. A man had to be 40 years old to run for the praetorship, and 42 years old to run for the consulship. Under the Lex Sempronia de Provincies Consularibus, Candidates such as Caesar could win the praetorship, serve their year in Rome, then go to their provinces, as Caesar had gone to Hispania. Once there, they could find any excuse for war, as Caesar had done against Lusitania. Upon being hailed imperator on the field, he could then return to Rome the following year, covered in military glory, and count on that quick fame to catapult himself to the consulship. Or, as Marcus Aemilius Scaurus had done, one could simply strip his province of its wealth in order to buy his way into office. Under the Senatus Consultum of late 53 BC, a praetor could no longer leave to govern his province until he was 45 years old. Not only did Calvinus and Rufus hope this would stop candidates from borrowing extreme amounts from moneylenders, guaranteeing they would wage war or plunder their provinces in order to repay their outrageous debts, but also that those running for the consulship at the age of 42 would have to do so without first leaving the city for the purpose of seeking celebrity. By the time Pompeius Magnus was called on to assume the consulship without a colleague, towards the end of February of 52 BC, the Senatus Consultum of 53 BC was still only a proposal. As consul without a colleague, and holder of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, Pompeius's first priority was the safety of the city, which he delivered by bringing in troops to occupy Rome. Once Rome was safe, Pompeius named his arch-conservative father-in-law, Metellus Scipio, as his colleague in the consulship. Scipio immediately set out to help Cato and the Boni hinder Caesar's plans to run for the 49 BC consulship, by endeavoring to ratify a new law which would prohibit consular candidates from standing in absentia. In order to stand for the 49 BC consulship, Caesar would have to enter the city, which would immediately nullify his imperium, and with it, his prosecutorial immunity. In response to Metellus Scipio's proposed new law, all 10 of the 52 BC tribunes of the plebs, each in the pay of Caesar, agreed to take advantage of the celebratory news that Caesar had defeated Vercingetorix. Backed by a massive wave of sudden popularity for Caesar, and the 20 days of thanksgiving which had been awarded to Rome for his victories in Gaul, the tribunes of the plebs passed a separate law which exempted Caesar from Scipio's law regarding in absentia candidates. Every attempt made by Senate conservatives to oppose this exemption was vetoed by the tribunes, and so Caesar won the right to stand for his next consular election in absentia, despite the efforts of Cato and the Boni. But Pompeius Magnus had his own card to play. Pushing the 53 BC Senatus Consultum through the Senate, and making it applicable to consuls as well as praetors, Pompeius passed the Lex Pompeia de Provincies. Now, not only could praetors no longer take advantage of provinces to build themselves up for consular election, but consuls could no longer use their immediate proconsulships to extend their imperium, and avoid prosecution. Caesar could stand for the consular election in absentia. He could even win. Pompeius didn't care. Because in 48 BC, when Caesar's term ended, so too would his imperium. For 5 years Caesar would be a private citizen, open to prosecution for his many, many crimes, which included passing illegal legislation in 59 BC, causing public violence, arresting senators who opposed him, and for unilaterally making war in a province on which the Roman Senate had not declared war. And while Caesar was being prosecuted, Pompeius Magnus would still hold imperium from the 5-year extension he had granted himself as proconsul of Hispania. Marcus Licinius Crassus, given a 5-year term as proconsul of Syria by the Lex Trebonia, had started a war with Parthia which had cost him his life, as well as the life of his son. Caesar, following his next consulship, could look forward to a future of continual prosecution in the courts, which would likely lead to his exile from Rome. And Pompeius Magnus, as the last of the triumvirs still standing, could now anticipate life as Rome's next Lucius Cornelius Sulla.